Vic and Christine, a love story, written by Barron Darby, a books by Barron production. For anyone who ever wondered if real love still exists, it does. It is patient, it is intentional, and sometimes it finds you behind a wall. Chapter 1. Flatbush. I grew up in a house full of women, and I want you to understand what that actually means before we go any further. My mother, 4 sisters, 1 boy. That was the household in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and for a long time that was everything I knew. A neighborhood built by Caribbean families who came here with nothing and decided that nothing was not going to stay nothing. People who put down roots on city blocks that didn't always welcome them, who built communities out of sheer will and faith and the particular stubbornness that comes when home is something you have to make rather than something you're given. That's what Flatbush was. That's the air I breathed growing up. My father wasn't in the picture. I've reflected on that a great deal over the years, and I want to be real about what that means, not just as a personal story, but as something a lot of Black men know. The absence of a father doesn't just leave a hole in a boy's life. It leaves a question, a fundamental one. What does it mean to be a man? And when there's nobody in the house to show you, you go looking. Sometimes in the right places, sometimes in the wrong ones. For a while, I was deep in the wrong ones. And the hard truth is that for young Black men in neighborhoods like mine, the wrong places have a way of becoming permanent. I watched it happen to people I loved. My mother was extraordinary. She raised 5 of us, 4 girls and 1 boy. One hard-headed boy who thought he knew more than he did, and she did it with a strength that only Black mothers in America are asked to carry the way she carried it. Present, intentional, the kind of woman who loves you hard enough to hold you accountable because she knows what happens to Black boys who don't have that accountability holding them. She was not just raising a son. She was trying to save one, and because of her, I had a foundation, not a perfect foundation, but a real one, the kind you can build something on. The neighborhood, though, Flatbush has a way of testing that foundation. I watch people around me get pulled sideways, friends who were smart, who had potential, who made one wrong turn and then another, and then found themselves somewhere none of us wanted to be. Jail, or worse. I understood the pull. I was not exempt from it. There were years where the undertow had me too, and I want to be honest about something. As a young Black man in Flatbush, the margin for error is different than it is in other places. One wrong night, one wrong decision. The consequences don't look the same for everyone, and I knew that even when I was too young to have the words for it, high school nearly didn't happen for me. I'll be honest about that. I barely graduated, not because I lacked the ability. I was chess player smart, and I knew it, but because I was young and undirected, and the streets had more immediate answers than the classroom did. Intelligence without direction is just energy, without a destination. You can be the sharpest mind on the block and still end up nowhere if you can't find something to point yourself toward. 2 things saved me. Football, which gave me a reason to show up and stay on the right side of things, and a principal named Miss Keels, who saw something in me worth fighting for and made sure I crossed that finish line when it would have been easy for everyone to look the other way. She didn't have to do that. She did it anyway. And then there was Mrs. Kinloch, my cousin's mother, a woman I will owe a debt to for the rest of my life. when every college I applied to sent back rejections. And they all did, because I had missed checking a single box that would have sent my application to every CUNY school in New York. She didn't accept that as the end of the story. She marched me personally to the admissions office at SUNY Old Westbury and refused to take no for an answer. She sat there with me. She made the case for me when I was too young and too stubborn to make it for myself. I was accepted. I think about that moment more than people might expect. One woman, one afternoon, one refusal to let my story end there. That's all it took. One person who decided that the boy from Flatbush who couldn't find the right box to check deserved a second look. I don't know where I am today without her. I honestly don't. God used her. That's the only way I know how to say it. When I look back at the chain of small interventions that kept me on the right side of my own life, I don't know what else to call them. Miss Keels, Mrs. Kinlock, the football coach who saw something in a kid from Flatbush. Each one of them placed exactly where they needed to be, at exactly the moment I needed them most. I got to college. I worked hard. I kept going. I eventually became a professor at Ohio State University, a fact that would have been unimaginable to the boy who almost didn't graduate high school. A black man from Flatbush, standing in front of a classroom at one of the biggest universities in the country. I never took that lightly, not for one day, because I knew exactly how many things had to go right and how many things almost went wrong for me to be standing in that room. But that's the thing about the path God lays out for you. It doesn't always look like anything from where you're standing. It only makes sense when you look back. I moved to Columbus. I built a life there, a career, a community, a rhythm that was mine. My faith became the bedrock of everything. Not a Sunday morning decoration, not a box I checked on an application. A living thing, something I was actively trying to grow into, to let shape the way I made decisions and carried myself and showed up for the people around me. What I didn't have was a partner. I had dated, I had cared about people, but there was always this gap between finding someone to spend time with and finding someone you actually wanted to build a life with. And I was private enough, intentional enough. My friend Karen called me a Doberman, slow to open up, protective of what was mine, that I wasn't willing to settle for the gap just because I was tired of the distance. The right person hadn't come through the gate yet. I didn't know, at that point in my life, that she was living in Cleveland, that she had a cat named Jill and a go-to question she used on first dates, and a faith that ran just as deep as mine. I didn't know any of that. But God knew, and God, it turns out, had a plan. Chapter 2. Morristown. Morristown, Ohio is a village, not a town, a village. And I really need you to sit with that distinction, because it matters more than it might seem. When I tell people where I grew up, they usually picture something charming, a main street with a diner, a little league field, maybe a church at the center of town where everybody knows everybody's name, in a warm and wholesome kind of way. That's not what Morristown was. I graduated high school with 46 people. 46. My whole graduating class could fit in a large living room. There were cornfields. There were cows. There was not, by any meaningful stretch of the imagination, much of the wider world. But here's what there was. My mother. My mom was a nurse. A good one. A dedicated one. the kind who drove an hour and a half each way to Cincinnati so she could do work that mattered, even when it would have been easier to find something closer and simpler. She was away a lot. That's just the honest truth of it. My two sisters were much older than me. One was 14 years older, the other 22, which meant that in practical terms, for most of my growing up years, it was mostly just me and a mom who was often at work, and a house that needed me to figure things out on my own. I figured things out on my own. I became a latchkey kid by necessity and an independent person by nature. I was, as I've described myself more than once, a good bad kid. Straight A's, National Honor Society, sports, and also parties in backyards, running with an older crowd, showing up at exactly the kinds of places a girl with a midnight curfew had no business being. I was curious about the world in a way that a small village couldn't fully satisfy, and I had enough intelligence to navigate the parts of life I probably shouldn't have been navigating yet without completely derailing myself. Looking back now, I know that God was watching over me even when I didn't know I needed watching. There were so many moments where things could have gone differently, where the choices I made at 17, living on my own with twins named Casey and Courtney, because I'd moved out of the house my senior year. Yes, I moved out of the house my senior year. Could have led me somewhere I didn't want to end up. They didn't. Something was looking out for me before I had the language for what that something was. I left Morristown for Cincinnati the first real chance I got. College felt like arriving at the world. A real city, real people, real possibility. I was hungry for it in a way that only makes sense if you understand where I came from. I pushed through, earned my degree, kept going until I had my master's as well. Because that's who I am. I don't do things halfway. If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it all the way. I built a career in healthcare as a speech-language pathologist. It's work that requires you to pay close attention to people, to listen carefully, to understand what someone is trying to say, even when the words aren't coming out the way they should. I love that about it. I'm a person who pays attention, a person who notices things. It's just how I'm wired. And then I made my way to Cleveland, which felt finally like arriving at something worth staying for. A real city with real rhythms, a community, a career I was proud of, friends I loved, an apartment that was mine, with a cat named Jill, who had been my grandmother's before she was mine, inherited after my grandmother passed. Jill was elderly and opinionated and did not warm to just anyone. She assessed every new person in her life with a particular patience that I deeply respected. We understood each other. I was good. I want you to know that. I was not a woman sitting in her apartment in Cleveland, pining away for something she didn't have. I had built a life I was genuinely proud of. I had my career, my friendships, my faith, my independence. I was complete. But I was also honest with myself. Comfortable and fulfilled are not the same thing. And the dating scene, well, the men I encountered in Cleveland were fine. Some of them were genuinely good people. But there was always something missing. That quality of intentionality, that willingness to go deep instead of staying on the surface where everything is easy and nothing costs you anything. I wanted a partner who matched the energy I brought to my own life, someone who wasn't intimidated by a woman who knew her worth, someone who would go all the way in instead of keeping one foot out the door in case something better came along. I had been looking for that man for a long time. I hadn't found him yet. But one evening after work, scrolling through social media with Jill keeping me company, I came across something that looked like it might, just possibly, be the most unexpected door I had ever walked through. I almost kept scrolling. Thank God I didn't. Chapter 3. The Professor. Let me tell you what my life looked like before any of this happened, because context matters. I was a professor at Ohio State University. I taught. I mentored students. I showed up for my work with everything I had, because I had learned early, and Flatbush taught me this lesson early, that the opportunities you get are not guaranteed, and you do not waste them. That is a truth that hits differently when you grew up watching it go the other way for people who deserved better. I carried that knowledge into every classroom. I still do. Being a Black professor at a major university is its own particular experience. You learn to move in spaces that weren't always built with you in mind. You carry a professionalism that is not optional, not a choice, but a necessity, because the margin for being read wrong is narrower than it is for other people. You code switch without always realizing you're doing it, between the man who walks into a faculty meeting and the man who calls his mother on Sunday. You hold a lot simultaneously. You represent in ways you didn't necessarily sign up to represent. And you do it because the students in your classroom, especially the ones who look like you, need to see that it's possible. My students were great. Columbus students have an energy that I genuinely loved. Curious, engaged, occasionally a little too engaged, as I would find out much later when one of them raised their hand in the middle of a lecture and said, "I saw you on my For You page," which was not the most academic moment of my career, but that's a story for a different chapter. I was intentional in my career. I was intentional in my faith. I was intentional in my friendships, and I was intentional, sometimes to a fault, in my approach to relationships. What I mean by that is this: I don't let people in easily. There's a version of that which is just personality. I'm an introvert. I'm private. I'm protective of what's mine. But there's also a version of it that is cultural. Black men in America are not always given safe spaces to be vulnerable. We are taught early to be strong, to hold it together, to keep the guard up. That's not an excuse. It's a reality that I've had to consciously work against in my own life. Karen, one of my closest friends, calls me a Doberman, slow to trust, deliberate, someone who keeps a firewall between his personal life and the world and doesn't open the gate for just anyone. I'd had relationships. I'd cared deeply about people. But there was always this specific gap I couldn't close, the gap between finding someone good and finding someone who was, in the deepest possible sense, yours. The person you don't have to perform for, the person you don't have to manage, the person who meets the real version of you, not the polished front-facing version, but the 6 a.m. version, the uncertain version, the version that's still working some things out, and chooses that person anyway. I was looking for longevity, not a relationship that felt good in the easy moments, one that was built for the hard ones. My faith was central to all of this, not in an abstract way, in a practical, daily, informs how I make decisions kind of way. The faith I had developed wasn't something I wore on Sundays and put away Monday morning. It was the foundation of how I thought about everything: my work, my character, my relationships, my future. And it meant that the person I was looking for had to share that foundation. Not match it exactly, but share it. Because two people trying to build a life on different ground are going to have a very hard time. I wasn't meeting that person through ordinary channels. Columbus is a good city. It's real and vibrant, and I loved it. But the dating landscape wasn't producing what I was looking for. So I had quietly arrived at a place of patient waiting, not passive waiting. I was living my life fully, but patient, trusting that God was working on something even when I couldn't see the shape of it. And then Karen texted me on what must have been an ordinary Tuesday, the way Karen does. "Love is blind," she said, "was casting in Columbus." I said no, and then I picked up the application, and then I sat with it for longer than I expected. And then, slowly, I started to understand that maybe the door I had been waiting for looked nothing like what I had imagined. Chapter 4. What am I looking for? Before I found that casting post, I had spent a meaningful amount of time asking myself one specific question. Not what kind of man do I want? That's the easy version, the Pinterest board version, the list on a notes app version. Height, eyes, career, sense of humor, check, check, check. I'd made that list. Most people have. It doesn't get you very far. The question I was actually asking was harder. It was, what kind of relationship do I want? What does it actually look like when love is functioning the way it's supposed to? What am I really hoping to build? And the answer, when I got quiet enough to hear it, was surprisingly clear. I wanted someone who was as intentional about his life as I was about mine. Someone who showed up. Someone whose words matched his actions. Because I had been in situations where they didn't, and I knew the particular exhaustion of that. I wanted someone whose faith was real, not performed, not decorative, but actually lived. And I wanted someone who could handle all of me, not just the easy parts, not just the version of Christine I put together for first impressions, all of it. That is a specific thing to be looking for. I knew it. I wasn't under any illusions that this combination was easy to find. My career as a speech-language pathologist had, in some ways, made me more attuned to people than was always comfortable. You spend your days listening to what people are really trying to say, underneath the words they're actually producing. You learn to pay attention to what someone reveals in the spaces between what they say. And that skill, which serves me beautifully in my professional life, made me a little difficult to fool in my personal one. I had dated. I had been in situations that seemed promising and then revealed themselves to be something less than that. Not because the men were bad people. Mostly they weren't. But there's a difference between someone who is good and someone who is right. And I had gotten clear enough on the distinction that I wasn't willing to accept one when I was looking for the other. I had something in my personal life that grounded all of it, which was my faith. It had grown in me slowly, quietly, since those years in Morristown when I was technically on my own, but never, I now understood, actually alone. It had deepened in Cincinnati and continued deepening in Cleveland. It was the through line of my life, and any person who wanted to share my life needed to be on that same path, or at least headed in that direction with genuine intention. I want to be honest about something else, too. Something I don't always say out loud, but that was real going into this. I grew up in Morristown, Ohio. 46 people in my graduating class. Virtually no diversity. I had lived most of my life in spaces that were predominantly white, and somewhere in my honest self-reflection before walking into that experiment, I had to ask, am I ready to be in an interracial relationship? Not just emotionally, but really. Do I understand what that means, what it asks of me, what it will look like when the world weighs in? Because the world does weigh in. Love is blind. But people in America are not. I knew that. And I also knew that I was someone who leads with her whole heart, who had spent her career learning to listen to people and understand their experience, and that this would require the same openness and humility, applied personally, not just being willing to love across difference, but being willing to learn, continuously, without fragility. That felt like something I could commit to. And then there were the usual insecurities, the vulnerabilities that come with years of putting yourself out there and having things not work out. There's a layer you develop, a small voice that starts to wonder, after enough disappointment, whether the thing you're looking for actually exists. I didn't let that voice run the show, but it was there. And then I saw the casting post for Love is Blind, and my first reaction was, honestly, skepticism. Is this an AI thing? Is this spam? Who actually does this? I almost kept scrolling, but I clicked on it instead, and the application opened, and something quietly but unmistakably shifted. Chapter 5. The Application. Karen sent me that text on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate because Karen always shows up when the timing seems impossible to explain. She knew my love life. She knew my history. She knew the Doberman in me, the introvert, the man who keeps a firewall between his personal life and the world. And she looked at all of that and said, with a specific confidence of someone who has known you long enough to see around your own blind spots, Love is Blind is casting in Columbus. You should try. My initial reaction was immediate and firm. No, absolutely not. This is not my style. I am not a man who wants his personal life displayed for a television audience. That goes against everything I value about protecting what is private and sacred. I can be forward-facing when the situation calls for it. I'm a professor. Walking into a room full of people and commanding their attention is part of the job. But that is professional. That is chosen. And there is something specific about being a black man on national television that I had to think about seriously. The way you get read, the way you get edited, the way people form opinions about who you are based on 45 minutes of footage, and what that means for someone who has spent his whole life being intentional about how he moves through the world. That is nothing like handing the most guarded parts of yourself over to cameras and producers and millions of strangers watching on Netflix. Hard number. And then I picked up the application. I don't know exactly what made me look at it again. Something in me that was curious. Something in me that was, if I'm being honest, a little tired of the patient waiting and ready for the patience to turn into something. Whatever it was, I found myself reading through the application, and what I encountered was not what I expected. They were not asking me to describe my ideal type. They were not asking me what I looked for in a first impression, or what my dating history looked like in broad, superficial strokes. The questions were thought-provoking. They were the kind of questions that slow you down because you cannot answer them on autopilot. Strengths, weaknesses, what I was working toward, what I had learned from my past, what I was not willing to compromise on. I sat with those questions for a long time, and as I sat with them, something happened that I can only describe as cathartic. It was, in its own unexpected way, not unlike therapy. I was being asked to reflect on who I actually was and what I actually wanted in writing, with a seriousness and depth that the ordinary dating world rarely required of me. I answered them honestly, more honestly, I think, than I had answered questions about myself in a while. I submitted the application. Approximately 2 weeks later, I heard back. 2 weeks after that, I was in the pods. The speed of that timeline is something Christine and I have talked about many times since. She had been in the process for months, background checks, psychological evaluations, callback after callback after callback. She had been working toward this moment for the better part of a year. I applied and was cast in a matter of weeks. When she found out, she was briefly convinced the producers had deliberately matched us, that someone had read both of our applications, seen the parallels, the faith, the intentionality, the similar values, and said, "These two people belong together." It felt, she told me, too precise to be accidental. It was not accidental, but it also wasn't a production team. There's only one word I know for what it was: divinely ordained. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it as a figure of speech. I say it because when I look at the timeline, at how quickly the door opened, at who I found standing on the other side of it, I genuinely cannot find a better explanation. Something arranged those pieces, something much bigger than casting decisions or application reviews. I was going to the pods, and somewhere in Cleveland, a woman with a cat named Jill, and a go-to question about Tuesdays and Sundays, was already on her way there too. Chapter 6. 2 hours. I almost scrolled past it. That is the truest version of how this started. I was home in my Cleveland apartment after work, with Jill keeping me company in the way she did, which was to sit near me but not too near me, maintaining the dignified distance of a cat who has decided she will tolerate your presence, but is not going to fawn over you about it. I was scrolling through social media, the evening routine, not expecting anything in particular. And then I saw it. Love is Blind was casting in Ohio. My first thought, is this an AI thing? Is this some kind of spam? In a world where everything on the internet is trying to get something from you, a post about a reality TV show casting in your specific state feels like the kind of thing you click past without reading. But I clicked anyway. The application opened. I started reading, and the questions were not what I expected. They were real questions, the kind that require you to stop and actually think, not just produce an answer. What did I want in a partner? What had I learned from my past relationships? What were my values, my non-negotiables, the things I would not compromise on? They were introspective in a way I had not anticipated, and they pulled something out of me that I did not know was ready to come out. I spent 2 hours on that application, 2 hours I had not planned to spend, and somewhere in the middle of those 2 hours, the mood shifted from casual curiosity to genuine investment. I was enjoying it. That's the only word for it. I was enjoying the act of thinking carefully about who I was and what I wanted, and putting it into writing for no one I would ever meet. Except, it turns out, one person I would. I listed a coworker as a reference, half joking, genuinely not expecting anything to come of it. Hit submit. Went to bed. Jill settled at the foot of the mattress with the quiet authority of a cat who has decided where things belong. The process that followed was long. Background checks, psychological evaluations, callbacks, and more callbacks. By the time I walked into those pods, I had been in this pipeline for months of not being able to tell people what I was doing, of managing the quiet excitement of something that might be real against the very reasonable possibility that it wouldn't go anywhere. Every step of the way I thought, this is probably as far as it goes. And every step of the way, another door opened. I walked in with a strategy. That's just who I am. I think things through. I prepare. As a speech-language pathologist, I am professionally trained to understand that how you ask a question shapes the answer you receive. So I had constructed a question that would tell me what I actually needed to know without being so direct that it felt like an interrogation. The question was, what do you do on a Tuesday? And what do you do on a Sunday? A Tuesday tells you about someone's habits, their work ethic, their social rhythms, the texture of an ordinary day, how they actually live, not how they want to be seen. A Sunday tells you something more. Do you go to church? Is too blunt, too easy to perform for, too simple to say yes to without meaning it. But what do you do on a Sunday? That's a window. You can see through it if you're paying attention. I use that question with everyone in those pods, almost everyone. There was one man who walked in and changed the shape of the whole conversation before I even got to it. Chapter 7. The Pods. I want to tell you what it's actually like in those pods, because the television version compresses something that in real life has a very specific texture. You sit in a room with a wall between you and another person. That's it. There is no face to read, no physical presence to interpret, no body language sending signals your brain can't help but process. There is only voice and words, and whatever truth you choose to offer or withhold. All the shortcuts that we use in ordinary life to understand a person. Attractiveness, height, the way someone carries themselves, first impression magnetism. None of it is available to you. You are left with exactly what someone actually says and how they say it. That environment does something to a conversation. It strips it down. And for a man who had always been private, always been careful, always been a little slow to show the parts of himself he considered valuable and rare, it was surprisingly freeing. Nobody could see me. Nobody was watching my face or reading my posture. It was just words, and I am someone who knows how to use words when I'm not worried about what I look like while I'm using them. I was deliberate going in. I knew what I was looking for, and I knew it without being able to name it easily. What I wanted was someone who was in the same place I was. Not the same background, not the same story, but the same orientation, the same understanding that this was not a game, not a storyline, not something to optimize for entertainment value. I was there because I was genuinely ready to find someone to build a life with, and I was screening, in my quiet way, for people who were there for the same reason. There was something else I was listening for, and I want to be honest about it because it's real. As a black man going into a dating experiment with no control over who I'd meet, I had to know, early, without being obvious about it, whether any attraction was genuine, because there is a kind of attention that black men receive that isn't actually about them. It's about an idea, a novelty, and I had been around long enough to recognize it. I remember being on a date in those pods where someone said something about flavor, as in, I like a little flavor. And I'm like, no, hard stop. That's not what I'm here for. I'm not someone's adventure. I'm a man looking for a partner. And the woman on the other side of that wall needed to understand the difference. I moved on. Some connections I explored more than others. I went furthest with Dynasty and Brit. Both of them had substance, things worth exploring. I was never rude to anyone, never short, never dismissive. But there is a difference between a conversation that is engaging and a conversation that changes something in you. And then there was this woman. I don't remember exactly how it started. I remember that within minutes, the conversation had a quality that none of the others had. The depth arrived without effort. She wasn't performing. She wasn't hitting emotional beats, because she'd watched enough seasons to know which ones the show rewarded. She was simply present and honest and interested in the real thing, and I could feel it. I brought up faith early, not strategically. It just came out, because faith is not a credential I put on a shelf and pull down for special occasions. It is in the texture of how I talk about my life. It shaped how I described what I wanted and why I wanted it. And when I said it, something changed on the other side of that wall. She told me later. My ears perked up. What followed across multiple conversations over the days in those pods was the kind of dialogue I had been looking for my entire adult life and had not been able to find in ordinary circumstances. We talked about faith as a living practice, not a checkbox, not a background detail, but something we were both actively trying to grow into. We talked about where we were in our lives, what we were working toward, what we believed about love and commitment, and what it meant to build something that was meant to last. If we walk into a pod and the first thing you want to talk about is something superficial, that's not what I'm looking for. But here was this woman, lighting up my world in a completely different way. No physical element, just mature, intentional conversation. Someone signaling to me, I am looking for longevity. I'm not here to play. I thought, that's what I want. Every time I walked in and it wasn't her, I was going through the motions. Not unkindly. I was present. I was respectful. But I was aware that I was elsewhere. And every time I walked in and it was her, something in me settled, exhaled, the 2-hour conversations that felt like 20 minutes. She told me about her survivorship, the anniversary of a car accident during her senior year of college, so severe that witnesses counted the car flipping 15 to 20 times at 70 miles an hour. She and her best friend Tori had survived it. Every year since, they marked the date together, called it their survivorship, in reflection and celebration of the second chances they had been given. The day she told me that story, it was the anniversary of the accident. She hadn't been able to spend it with Tori that year. She spent it with me instead. I want you to stop and sit with that for a second. This woman, who marks her survival every year with her best friend, spent that day talking to a stranger through a wall, and chose to, and felt held enough to share something that tender with someone she couldn't even see. I felt the full weight of that trust, and I received it the only way I knew how, completely. The details of the ways in which you survived, I told her, is nothing short of God's intervention. You are a walking miracle. There was a long quiet after I said it. the good kind of quiet, the kind that means something landed. I proposed before the first week of season 10 was done. We were the first couple, and unlike some proposals in those pods that carry a tremor of uncertainty underneath them, ours carried the weight of something already decided. I did not propose because the show wanted me to. I proposed because I already knew. And you can tell the difference if you're paying attention. You can always tell the difference. Chapter 8. I never got to my question. He brought up faith before I could get there. That is the thing that still makes me smile when I think about it. I had this carefully constructed approach. The Tuesday-Sunday question, designed to reveal something real without being so direct it felt like an interrogation. I had used it with every man I sat down with in those pods. It was my go-to, my system. The thing I had built to protect me from wasting time on connections that couldn't hold the weight of what I actually cared about. And then I sat down with Vic, and the conversation was just natural. Completely, disarmingly natural. There was no moment where I thought, okay, now I'll ask my question. We were already somewhere deeper than that before I had a chance to get there. And before I could even locate the opening I had planned for, he brought faith up himself. Not as a talking point. Not in the way people sometimes bring up faith on reality television, because they know it reads well, or because they've watched enough seasons to know what kind of answer gets a good response. He brought it up the way someone talks about something that's actually true. It was woven into how he described his life, his values, the way he made decisions. My ears perked up. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Because I had been waiting for that, not aggressively, not as a deal breaker on a checklist, but as a signal, as the thing that would tell me whether the person on the other side of this wall was someone I could really talk to, or someone I would be spending the next few days making polite conversation with while my heart was somewhere else. It was not polite conversation. It was the real thing. I tried to explore other connections because the show asks you to, and because it's fair. What if you would have found your person somewhere you didn't expect? I spoke with Mike for a few days, Devante for a couple. I was present. I genuinely tried. But I was, as I admitted later with a level of honesty I can only describe as embarrassing in the best way, devastated every time I walked in, and it wasn't Vic, not dramatically devastated, just aware that I was going through the motions instead of being in the thing I actually wanted to be in. I wanted the 2-hour conversations. The one that changed everything was the survivorship conversation. My accident had happened during my senior year of college. The car flipped, witnesses said, 15 to 20 times at 70 miles an hour. My best friend Tori and I had walked out of that vehicle, not without injury, not without fear, but walking. Every year since, we mark the anniversary of it together. We call it our survivorship, because that's what it is, a celebration of the fact that we are still here. The day I told Vic that story was the anniversary of the accident. I hadn't been able to spend it with Tori that year. I spent it with him instead, and the way he held that information, the care he brought to it, the weight he gave it, the way he looked at me through a wall he couldn't see through and called me a walking miracle. Something settled in my chest. There was also something I had to listen for carefully in those pods, and I'm going to say it plainly, because it deserves to be said plainly. I knew at some point the wall would come down, and whoever I was talking to would see that I was white. And I needed to know, before that moment, in the dark, where you can't perform for appearances, whether the connection was real, whether the attraction to whoever I was went beyond curiosity or novelty, whether I was going to be someone's experience or someone's partner. That is a specific thing to have to listen for. Most women don't have to factor that in. I did. Vic answered it without me asking. He found a way, naturally, to make clear that his interest in a person was about who that person was. He had already been on a date in those pods where someone said something careless, something about flavor, and he'd shut it down and moved on. He told me that. He didn't perform open-mindedness. He just showed it. And I understood, from listening to him, that I was not going to be a chapter in someone else's story. I was going to be chosen. Of course, he was intentional. That's the whole thing about Vic. He is the most intentional man I have ever met. When he proposed, it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of something that had already happened. We had found each other. Everything after that was just the world catching up to what the pods had already decided. I said yes with my whole heart. I have only one setting, and it's whole heart. Chapter 9. The Reveal. Before those doors opened, I prayed. I want to be specific about what that looked like, because I think it is important. I wasn't just saying a quick prayer the way people say things in a moment of nervousness. I was deliberate. I cleared my mind of everything I thought I knew, every unconscious hope or expectation I had accumulated, and I made myself a promise in that quiet space before the doors moved. It doesn't matter what she looks like. That is what I promised myself. I had given my heart to whoever was on the other side of that wall. Whoever walked through those doors was my wife, and I was going to receive her as such. To make it concrete, to make the promise real rather than just theoretical, I did something I don't think I've fully explained before. I tried to imagine, deliberately, the most challenging physical scenario I could conceive of. I said it in my mind. I looked at it, and I said, that person is my wife. I love that person. I choose that person. I meant it. I genuinely meant every word of it. There is something I did not share in the pods that I need to tell you now, because it is part of the story. I have an eye condition called keratoconus. It is a disease in which the cornea gradually loses its shape, distorting vision over time. I had gotten it treated, stopped its progression, but my vision was still imperfect. In low light, at a distance, the world went soft and blurred in ways that glasses couldn't fully correct. Sometimes when I'm not looking someone in the eye, I'm actually looking slightly past them, because I'm trying to find the focus. The pods did not require vision, so it hadn't come up, but the reveal required me to walk towards someone I could not yet see clearly. The doors opened, and I walked. I could see a silhouette coming toward me, something beautiful, but I couldn't see her face yet, not really, not the way you see someone when you know them. And here is what I want you to understand about that walk. I was not anxious. I was not uncertain. The prayer had done its work. I had already decided. I was walking toward my wife. She got closer. My vision sharpened. And then I could see her. Beautiful. That's the word. The simplest, most accurate word available. She was beautiful, and she was beaming, not the television-ready version of smiling, actually beaming, the kind of light that comes from somewhere deeper than the moment, that tells you a person is feeling something they didn't have to perform. And she was looking at me with these eyes that I had come to know through a wall, through hours of conversation, through the particular quality of attention that a person gives you when they are actually paying attention. And now I could finally see what those eyes looked like. I thought, wow. And then I thought something I was not expecting to think. Thank you. Just thank you. For all of it. For the chain. For Mrs. Kinloch in the admissions office and Karen's text on a Tuesday, and the application and the prayer and the pods and every single thing that had to happen exactly the way it happened to get me standing in this moment, looking at this woman. Thank you. There was absolutely nothing to worry about. There never was. What I said to her in that moment, I said partly in the form of a poem I had prepared. Not because I'm always a man who writes poems. I'm not. But because this moment deserved more than improvisation. It deserved intention. And so I had thought about what I wanted to say to her when I finally got to see her. And I had put it into words in advance. And I said those words. She told me afterward that the poem settled her fears, that there had been a small voice, she called it a little guy on her shoulder, that had been whispering its doubts in the way that voices do. What if he doesn't find me attractive? What if I'm not what he imagined? And the poem, apparently, quieted that voice. I'm glad. I'm more than glad. Because I had done the work of the prayer precisely so that I could arrive at her without conditions. And the poem was the proof of that work. Not words I said in the moment, but words I had thought through in the quiet before the moment. Because she deserved to be received with intention. Not improvisation. Intention. She was everything I had hoped for and more. And I had hoped for everything. I had prayed before the doors opened. I had meant every word of the prayer. And then the doors opened, and God apparently wanted me to know that when you approach something with that kind of faith, you tend to land somewhere worth landing. Chapter 10. I lost every word. In my head going into that reveal, I had a vision. It was not a very flattering vision for Vic, and I owe him this story, because it is genuinely funny and also very telling about how the pods work on your imagination. There had been a story told in those pods. I don't remember exactly how it came up, but it involved Vic and a vacation to Puerto Rico, and him and his friends convincing some bartenders that they played for the Detroit Lions. It was one of those stories that is funnier the more you picture it. And for reasons I cannot fully explain, my brain decided to use that story as the primary source material for building a mental image of Vic. He played for the D line, my brain insisted, confidently and incorrectly. So I had prepared myself for a short, stocky guy, broad. Maybe not very tall. I had genuinely prepared for this. I told myself, I don't care. I came here for somebody and I have that. Whoever walks through that door is the man who has been lighting up my world through a wall for days, and that's what matters. Malibu. Who? That's the energy I was trying to hold onto. The door opened. Victor St. John walked through it. He was tall. He was, and I am going to say this on the record, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. All my preparation, all my careful mental adjustment to the short, stocky D lineman scenario, evaporated in approximately 3 seconds. But here's the thing I want to be clear about, because it matters for the story. The physical was the cherry on top. It was not the thing. I had fallen for this man through a wall with no physical information available to me whatsoever. I had said yes to him before I knew what he looked like. So when the door opened and he turned out to be stunning on top of everything else, that was a bonus. A very significant bonus. But the thing, the actual thing, had already happened in the dark. There was one moment that I want to tell you about. He read me a poem. He had prepared something, and he read it to me. And I want you to know that I am not generally a woman who is undone by grand romantic gestures. I am too practical for that, too grounded. But this landed differently. It landed like something that had been specifically made for me, which of course it had been. Words he had thought about before I arrived, words he had put together in the quiet before the doors opened, because he wanted to receive me with more than just a reaction. I had prepared myself for anything. I had not prepared myself for that. And the little voice that had been sitting on my shoulder asking, what if he doesn't find me attractive? What if you're not his type? That voice went quiet, completely quiet, and it hasn't come back since. It went quiet because this man had prayed before those doors opened. He had made himself a promise, and then he had written me a poem, and then he walked toward me with that particular steadiness that is just who he is, deliberate, warm, completely at home in the moment, and looked at me the way you look at someone you have already decided about. He also told me later about the keratoconus, about how his vision was soft and blurry at distance, which meant that for most of that walk toward me, he could barely see me. He was walking toward a silhouette, a shape coming into focus, holding on to his prayer and his promise, and trusting that whatever came into view would be his. I have thought about that many times since. He was walking toward me before he could see me, and the whole thing, the pods, the wall, the conversations, the engagement, the prayer, the poem, the whole thing was built on the premise that you choose a person before you have all the information. You choose them when you can't see them clearly. You choose them on faith. That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard, and I married the man who lived it. Chapter 11. Malibu. They told me we weren't going to Mexico. Out of 7 couples in our season, Vic and I were the only ones who didn't go on the group trip. The production team sat me down, told me they had seen our love story, believed in what we had, and wanted to send us somewhere on our own instead. Malibu, California. A private resort. Just the 2 of us. My first reaction, and I want to be honest about this because I think it's the human reaction, was the small sting of not going. There is something in the psychology of these shows where you become aware of the group, of belonging and not belonging. And when you're excluded from the group experience, even for a nice reason, there is a brief moment of, wait, why not us? I had actually had a feeling going in that we wouldn't be going. Something in my gut, the way intuition sometimes knows things your brain is still processing, but knowing something in your gut and having it confirmed out loud are different experiences. And then they handed me an iPad, and Vic was on FaceTime, and he was, I want you to see this clearly because it tells you everything about who this man is. He was bright-eyed, already certain, already in it. "Hey, babe," he said, "so we're going to Malibu." And just like that, the sting was gone. Because when the person you love looks at you like that, like the answer is already yes and the details are just logistics, you don't need anything else. You don't need Mexico. You don't need a group trip. You need the thing you already have. We flew to Malibu, and Malibu was, in the way that the best things often are, nothing like what I had imagined, and everything I needed. The resort was nearly empty. There were maybe a couple of other guests, a friend group, some women on a trip. But for all practical purposes, it was just us and the Pacific Ocean and miles of quiet. We walked on the beach. We had meals that lasted as long as we wanted them to last. We did the sauna. We hit the gym a couple of times, because we are both the kind of people who keep their routines even when they're somewhere beautiful. We sat and watched the water and the birds and the particular quality of California light that does something to your sense of time and makes everything feel a little more permanent. We got our phones back for the first time in a while. We called our mothers. Brief calls. "Hi, I'm engaged. Here's where I am. I'm alive and healthy, and everything is good." And then we set the phones down and didn't pick them up again for the rest of the trip. We didn't need them. The world had gotten very small and very right. I've thought about what Mexico would have been like. Honestly, Vic and I probably would have been mom and dad to everybody. That's just who we are in a group dynamic. The stable center, the ones people come to when they need to feel anchored. We would have been fully present in everyone else's stories and only halfway present in our own. Malibu gave us something that Mexico couldn't have. Just us. No stage, no audience. Just two people who had said yes to each other and needed some time and space to understand what that meant. We used that time for the real conversations, the ones that happen when you're not worried about being overheard or watched or edited. What do we actually believe about marriage? What does a life together look like in the day-to-day? What are we working toward, and what are we afraid of? And what are the things we're going to have to figure out as we go? I came here for somebody, I thought, looking at the ocean. And I have that. Malibu, who? We flew back to Ohio knowing exactly what came next, Chapter 12, a season of driving. It was a lot of driving. Christine went back to Cleveland and her job in healthcare. I went back to Columbus and my students at Ohio State, an hour and a half between us, which is not an impossible distance, but is also not nothing. Not when you're doing it every week without exception, packing and unpacking and repacking, navigating the logistics of two full lives that haven't yet found a way to become one life in one place. We rotated. She would come to Columbus. I would go to Cleveland, back and forth, reliably and without complaint, because the alternative, not seeing each other for a week or 2 weeks, or however long it would have taken for the schedules to align, was simply not acceptable to either of us. We had waited long enough to find each other. We were not going to let geography make us casual about it. What people didn't always see about our situation was that it required more of us than the couples who were living together in their apartments and working through their challenges in the same space. There's a version of engagement that happens in proximity, where you can resolve things the same day they come up, where you share a kitchen and a routine and a running conversation. That was not our version. We had long phone calls in the evenings, the way people used to do before everyone had the same time zone. I joked that it was like being in high school again. We talked through things that other couples might have resolved over dinner. We built our relationship on purpose, deliberately, because every moment of it required intention. I want to say something about what that taught me. Effort in a relationship is a form of revelation. It shows you something about what you actually have that the feeling alone cannot show you. Not the feeling. The feeling comes and goes. It's beautiful, but it's not load-bearing on its own. But the effort, the willingness to pack a bag on a Thursday because you told someone you'd be there on Friday, the willingness to drive an hour and a half each way because the alternative is a week without the person who has become the clearest thing in your life. That effort told me more about what we had than any conversation in the pods did. And it told Christine something too, I think, that this was not a man who would give everything in a romantic setting and then recede when the setting became ordinary. This was a man who showed up when showing up required something. Meanwhile, the question of where we would ultimately land was already resolving itself. Columbus made sense, geographically, practically, in every dimension. It sat between Cleveland, where Christine had family, and southern Ohio, where more of her people were. My career was there. It was the clear answer, and Christine had already decided it before I had to ask. Then, without anyone planning it or arranging it, a position opened at Christine's company, her exact role, in Columbus. At the same time, she was preparing to make the move. I have stopped calling things like that coincidences. We got married in early April. By the end of May, Christine had started her new job in Columbus, and we were waking up in the same apartment. The driving was over. God had been arranging the details. We had just been faithful enough to keep driving until the arrangement was ready. Chapter 13. The Wedding Morning. I asked production for one specific thing. I said, I cannot walk past Vic's mother for the first time in my life as I'm heading down an aisle to marry her son. That is not how I want to meet that woman. I need to touch her first. I need to hug her. I need to look her in the eye and have a real moment, not a passing moment in a wedding processional. They obliged. What I did not know, what I found out in the minutes before everything began, was that Vic's sister Chandelle was also there. I met Chandelle approximately 5 minutes before the ceremony started. 5 minutes after that, she was officiating the wedding. And 5 minutes after that, she was my sister. I have tried to explain that progression to people, and it always sounds ridiculous, which is maybe why I love it so much. I met her 5 minutes before. Then the next 5 minutes she's marrying us. Then the next 5 minutes she's my sister. Within about an hour, my whole family had rearranged itself. That morning felt holy, even before we got to anything official. Vic's mother on one side, my mother on the other. 2 women who had raised 2 people who somehow found each other through a wall on a Netflix show, now standing in the same room, meeting for the first time. And I got to watch them hug. I want to say that slowly because I think it deserves the slowness. I watched the woman who made Vic and the woman who made me hold each other for the first time. These 2 mothers, from completely different worlds, different cultures, different experiences of what it means to raise a child in America, standing together, finding each other, finding warmth in each other. That is not a small thing. That is what love actually looks like when it crosses lines that the world says should keep people apart. His mother did not look at me with suspicion. She looked at me with love, and I understood in that moment that I was not just marrying Vic. I was being welcomed into a family, a culture, a story that was much bigger and much older than me. And I was going to have to earn my place in it, not perform my way in, earn it, through showing up, through learning, through loving their son the way he deserved to be loved, and never taking for granted what his family had built. I stood there watching, and I thought, this is the part they don't put in the wedding montages. This is the part that actually matters, not the dress, not the flowers. This. We had talked about eloping. I want you to know that, because it matters for understanding what the wedding ultimately became. It had been our genuine plan. After Malibu, when we thought filming was wrapping and we were going back to our regular lives, we had talked about doing something quiet and private, just the two of us, making it real without the spectacle. We are homebodies. We are introverts. Neither of us needs an audience to make something meaningful. But then the show offered us this, and standing there on the morning of April 9th, with our mothers and sisters and the people who had loved us the longest, all in the same room, I thought I would not trade this for the quiet version. I would not trade any of it. I walked down that aisle knowing I was making the right decision, not just in the vague, comfortable sense of feeling good about things, in the specific, deliberate, I have thought about this from every angle sense of genuine certainty. This was the man I had spent 2 hours filling out an application to find. This was the man who brought faith up before I could ask about it. This was the man who walked toward me through blurry vision, who prayed before the doors opened, who showed up every single week without fail during an hour-and-a-half commute that most people would have let become an excuse. He paused before he said, "I do." I know now that the pause was the instruction. They had told us to reflect before answering. But in the moment, I didn't know that. I had said yes immediately, enthusiastically, without a single second of hesitation because there was nothing to hesitate about. And then Vic paused, and I found out afterward that our friends in the audience had grabbed each other's legs in collective anxiety, had whispered what is happening, had genuinely worried for a terrifying few seconds. I had not worried for one moment, because I already knew. He said, "I do," and the room exhaled, and I became Christine St. John. Chapter 14. Not a Contract. The wedding was April 9th, and I want to tell you what I was thinking in the minutes before Christine came down that aisle, because nobody asks about that part. They ask about the proposal, the reveal, the moment. But the minutes before the moment, the space between the prayer ending and the music beginning, that is where the real thing lives. I was looking at the room, my people on one side, her people on the other, two families who had not known each other a year ago, now sharing the same air to witness the same moment. I was connecting the dots of everything that had led here, the Flatbush childhood, the football games that kept me on the right path, Mrs. Kinloch marching me to that admissions office, the decade of building something in Columbus, Karen's text on a Tuesday, the application, the pods, the wall, Malibu, the hour-and-a-half drives every week without exception. And with each dot I connected, I got more certain. My sister Chandelle officiated the wedding. Christine had met her approximately 5 minutes before we began. What I remember about watching that first meeting from across a room before I was supposed to see Christine is the immediacy of it. Chandel is warm in that specific and overwhelming way that my family is warm. The Caribbean warmth that doesn't ease into things but arrives all at once, and Christine received it the same way. Fully, without hesitation. Within minutes, they were hugging like people who had known each other for years. I thought, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. When Christine appeared at the end of that aisle, I absorbed every detail, the way she moved, the particular light that she carries in her face when she is fully present and fully herself, the fact that she was beaming, genuinely beaming, not performing joy, actually feeling it, in a way that told me everything I needed to know about the state of her heart. There was a brief pause before I said, I do. The pause was the instruction. They had told us to reflect, to give the moment its proper weight, to be present in the gravity of it before answering. Christine had not followed that instruction. She had said yes immediately, without a breath of hesitation, enthusiastically, with her whole everything, the way Christine does everything. My friends apparently lost several years of their lives in that pause, grabbed each other's legs, held their breath, thought this man was about to do something inexplicable on national television. He was not. He was reflecting, because the moment deserved it. I said, I do. And my friends in the audience exhaled like they had been holding their breath underwater. And Christine looked at me with those eyes I had come to know through a wall, that I had first seen clearly at a reveal, that I had been looking into across a kitchen table and a car console, and an hour-and-a-half commute for months. She looked at me, and she was radiant. Now I want to explain something about what those words meant to me, because I believe the explanation matters. I do not use the word marriage in the contract sense. I use the word covenant, and those are not the same thing. I grew up in a tradition where that word meant something. In the Black church, covenant is not abstract theology. It's lived. It's the thing that holds a community together when everything else is trying to pull it apart. I watched it in my mother's faith. I felt it in the church walls that were there for our family when the world wasn't. Covenant means you are bound by something bigger than your feelings on any given day. And I brought that understanding to the altar. A contract is transactional. 2 parties, a set of conditions, an implied exit clause for when the conditions cease to be met. Orderly, legible, perfectly reasonable as a legal framework, but not what we made. A covenant is a promise, not between 2 parties, but 3, Christine, me, and God, at the center of the triangle. It does not have an exit clause. It is not contingent on conditions being met. It is a declaration of oneness, not 2 people in an arrangement, but one flesh, 2 lives becoming one life, bound together in a way that paper cannot fully contain and time cannot fully erode. What that does, practically, is give us a foundation that does not depend on either of us being perfect, because we are not perfect. We are imperfect people who get impatient and frustrated and occasionally wrong. What brings us back to each other, what always brings us back, is not the performance of love, but the understanding of it. We are one flesh. We are in submission to something larger than either of us. And that larger thing, it turns out, is a very stable place to build a life. Christine said it simply, and she said it better than I did. It adds such a layer of security to it. I really have not ever trusted somebody with my heart, soul, mind, the whole thing, like I have with you. Not a contract, a covenant. The difference for us is everything. Chapter 15. Columbus. After the wedding, I moved to Columbus. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I moved for my husband is a sentence that women sometimes say in a way that minimizes what it actually involves. Moving is not just packing boxes. Moving is leaving behind the version of your life that you built specifically for the place you're in. It's leaving the grocery store where they know you, and the yoga instructor who knows about your back, and the coffee shop where they start making your order when they see you come through the door. It is leaving the people who fill in the texture of ordinary days. I had built a life in Cleveland, a real one, career I was proud of, community I loved, an apartment that was mine, with my particular rhythms and my cat. I did not walk away from any of that as if it were nothing. I walked away from it because the thing I was walking toward was everything. Jill came with me. This is important. Jill is approximately 14 years old. She was my grandmother's cat before she was mine, and when my grandmother passed, Jill came to live with me, which tells you something about both of us. Jill is small and elderly and has strong, clearly articulated opinions about most things. She does not warm to people quickly. She observes. She assesses. She reserves judgment for longer than is typically comfortable. She assessed Vic with the full weight of her personality. The process took weeks. There were days where she would settle near him, not touching him, but proximate, which in Jill's vocabulary is a significant concession. There were days she would bite him. Not viciously. He was always careful to clarify. Gently. A communicative bite, the kind that means, I haven't made a final decision about you yet, and I want you to know that. Vic described himself as a step-cat dad. He was patient about it. He did not try to rush her. He let her come to her own conclusions on her own timeline, which is, I should note, exactly how he handles most things in life, deliberately, without forcing, trusting that the right outcome will arrive if you give it the proper conditions. I watched him be patient with my cantankerous 14-year-old cat, and I thought, yeah, I made the right call. The job transition helped everything. My same position, my same company, a Columbus location opening at exactly the right moment. I started at the end of May. By summer, we had a routine, home-cooked meals. Our food backgrounds are delightfully different, which means our kitchen had a lot of creative conversations, and walks together, and love notes in places I didn't expect to find them. Waking up next to the same person every morning without having to pack a bag and drive an hour and a half home afterward. We joined a home church. We built a community there. When people asked how we met, we told them it was a blind date at a basketball game, which is technically not a lie. A blind date through a wall, before a show aired. Close enough. But walking into that church for the first time was its own experience, and I want to be honest about it. I grew up in a small Ohio village. The church I knew was quiet, measured. People sat in pews and followed along and kept their emotions fairly close to the chest. Vic's world of worship was different. The music moved through the room in a way that expected your body to respond. People raised their hands. People called out. The pastor talked to the congregation like they were in conversation, not just in attendance. And I stood there in the beginning not quite knowing what to do with myself. Not uncomfortable exactly, but aware that I was somewhere that had its own language, its own rhythms, its own way of being together before God. A way I hadn't grown up inside. I learned, slowly, imperfectly, with more than a few moments of doing the wrong thing at the wrong time and catching a look that told me so. But the community was kind to me, not universally, not immediately, but genuinely over time. Some people warmed quickly, some took longer, and some, particularly some of the black women, had a guardedness around me that I understood and did not resent. Because their guardedness wasn't about me personally. It was about something much older and much larger than one woman in a new church, and it was not my place to rush them past it. It was my place to show up, consistently, and let time do what time does. The food was its own education. Vic's people cook with a Caribbean depth of flavor that I had genuinely never encountered growing up in Morristown. The first time I cooked for his family, I was a nervous wreck, and the look his sister gave my casserole was diplomatic. I learned what seasonings belonged and which ones didn't. I learned the difference between rice that was done and rice that was done right. I learned that food is not just sustenance in his family. It is love expressed in a very specific and non-negotiable language. I tried to learn that language too. And the dancing. Lord, the dancing. His family doesn't need a party or a special occasion. Music comes on and people move. In the kitchen, at a cookout, in a living room at a Sunday gathering. A natural, intuitive, cultural fluency that lives in the body. I did not grow up with that fluency. My body did not automatically know what to do, but I tried. I laughed at myself when I got it wrong, which was often, and his family laughed with me, which was the grace I needed. They were not going to pretend I got it right when I didn't, but they also weren't going to let me stand on the sideline. Someone would grab my hand and pull me in. That is its own kind of welcome. The speech was another layer, not just the cadence of how Vic talked with his family versus how he talked at work, the code switching I had heard about, but now watched in real time, in real life, the shift that happens when a man moves between his professional world and his home world, between the version of himself that the institution requires and the version that belongs entirely to his people. I learned not to interrupt that shift. I learned to hear it as wholeness, not inconsistency. He was not two different people. He was one complete person, fluent in two worlds in a way I was still a student of. There were expressions I didn't know, references that went over my head and required a pause and an explanation. Moments where I said something that landed wrong because the words meant something slightly different in his cultural context than they did in mine, and someone would look at me, and Vic would quietly, gently, later explain. I was not always graceful about being corrected, but I was always willing, because the alternative, pretending I understood everything, performing fluency I didn't have, would have been a disrespect to everything and everyone I was trying to belong to. But I want to tell you about a harder conversation we had that aired on the show, because I think it matters. We talked about what it would mean to raise biracial children, and I was honest, genuinely, uncomfortably honest, about my uncertainty. Not about wanting those children, not about loving Vic, but about whether I would be able to fully relate to kids who would carry an experience of the world that I had never lived. I was raised in Morristown, Ohio. I did not grow up navigating what it means to be Black in America, and I was not going to pretend that gap didn't exist just because love was real. People were surprised by that conversation. I think they expected me to perform certainty, but certainty I don't have isn't something I'm willing to offer. What I have is the commitment to learn, to listen, to let Vic lead where he knows the terrain, and to show up as a student where I don't. A friend, someone in an interracial marriage with children of her own, sent me a message after the episode aired. She said, "Your children will find their identity in God first. Everything else is secondary." I held on to that. It gave me peace without giving me an excuse to stop growing. America doesn't make interracial love invisible. People have opinions. People look. People make assumptions about what Vic and I represent and what we don't. We can't control that. What we can control is what we build inside our own home and what we intentionally, faithfully pass on. We kept our caste relationships warm. Brittany and Ross came to our church. We ran into Breezy and Connor near our neighborhood, once outside a coffee shop, once just walking, in that specific way that a small city brings people back around to each other. Jordan Faith stayed in contact with Vic. I stayed close with Jess, who was finding her way to something beautiful after a hard season, and seeing her in that better place meant something. And quietly, in between all of it, we were building the thing. Not building it towards something, just building it. The ordinary accumulation of a life shared between two people who chose each other on purpose. It felt every day like exactly what it was. Chapter 16. Year 1. The first year of marriage is a particular kind of education. Nobody tells you this before it happens, or maybe they do, and you don't absorb it until you're in it. But the first year is not the honeymoon. The honeymoon is a moment, a feeling, a beautiful and temporary climate. The first year is the actual work, the negotiation, the discovery of all the ways that two fully formed adults with their own habits and rhythms and preferences have to figure out how to become, genuinely, one household and one life. For me, that work carried an extra layer of meaning. I thought about my father's absence. I thought about the men I'd watched growing up, who hadn't stayed, who hadn't built, who had let the weight of everything push them away from their families instead of toward them. I had spent my whole life determined not to be that story. And here I was, married, in my own home, building something intentional with a woman I chose and who chose me. That is not small. For a Black man who came from Flatbush, who almost didn't graduate high school, who had to have someone march him to a college admissions office. That is enormous. And I walked into year 1 of my marriage understanding exactly what it meant. I also want to tell you what it meant to watch Christine try. Because she did. That woman tried. She showed up to my family's gatherings and stood in rooms where she was the only white woman and did not shrink. She attempted the food, genuinely, earnestly, sometimes badly, but always genuinely. She sat in church and let the music come to her instead of standing stiff and separate from it. She tried to follow along when the conversation shifted into a cadence that wasn't hers, and when she got lost, she asked instead of pretending. She said the wrong thing occasionally and received the correction without becoming defensive about it. She danced. I need you to understand that she got out there and she danced, and it was not always right, and she laughed at herself and kept going. Do you know how much that meant to me? To watch the woman I married step into my world, the full, complex, layered world that I came from, not just the parts that are easy and universal, and choose to learn it. That is love. That is not performance. You can tell when someone is performing cultural openness and when they are actually doing the work. Christine was doing the work. Every Sunday, every family dinner, every moment she sat with my sisters and let herself be read before she was accepted, because that's what my sisters do, and she knew it, and she showed up anyway. Not everyone in my world was immediately warm to her. That's the honest truth, and it would be a disservice to pretend otherwise. There is a particular kind of guardedness that some black women carry toward this specific situation. A black man, a white woman, that is rooted in history and hurt that go back further than any of us. I understood it. Christine understood it. And we both understood that the answer was not to demand that guardedness dissolve. The answer was to be patient, to be consistent, to be real, and to trust that genuine love, shown over time, speaks for itself. It did. Christine and I are both introverts. That helps. Neither of us is someone who needs constant social stimulation or an endless parade of activity. We like home. We like evenings in. We like the particular satisfaction of a good meal at our own table and a quiet night without anywhere to be. That shared preference made a lot of things easier. What I had to work on was balance. I am a professor. I care deeply about doing that work well. I'm also someone navigating public life for the first time. A version of my face and story now existing in the world in a way that required management and attention and response. And I was building something with Christine in terms of our shared presence, our shared projects, the things we were beginning to create together. That is a lot of things to hold at once, and I did not always hold them in the right proportions. Christine was patient with me about it. She is better at drawing those lines than I am, at knowing when work has taken enough and the person in front of you needs the rest of your attention. She would tell me, not unkindly, when the balance was off, and I would reset, and then gradually I would let it drift again, and she would tell me again. This is what marriage actually looks like. The same gentle corrections, offered with love, over and over, as two people who genuinely want to do right by each other keep figuring out how. My students at OSU were enthusiastic about the whole thing, genuinely. One of them raised their hand in the middle of a lecture to tell me they'd seen me on their For You page. I had to explain, with whatever dignity I could muster in that moment, that this was not the time or place for that conversation. My colleagues were warm. The university had been good about everything. There was grace in the professional sphere that I was grateful for. Outside the professional sphere, there was noise. There's always noise. The internet is a place that has opinions about everything. And when your love story is visible, those opinions arrive whether you invite them or not. We were learning, in year 1, how to hold that noise at the right distance, close enough to hear if something genuinely needed a response, far enough away that it didn't get inside what we were building. Here's what we figured out, and I want to say it clearly. If you do not tell your own story, someone else will tell it for you, and they will fill in every gap and every silence with whatever serves the most engagement. not whatever is true. So we told our story. We showed up as ourselves. We let people see what was actually there. What was actually there was two people who loved each other, building something real, one ordinary day at a time. That is not dramatic. That is not particularly interesting to the internet, but it is exactly what we wanted. We also built a memory box. Into it went the key card from Calamigos Ranch in Malibu, plane ticket stubs, small objects from the places and moments that had made the year what it was. The plan was to open it on our first anniversary, to spread everything out across a table and go through it slowly, as a record, a time capsule, proof of what we had made in the first year of something that was meant to last a very long time. Year one was hard in the ways that first years are hard. It was also better than I deserved, better than what most people get. Two intentional people, a covenant instead of a contract, a faith at the center of the triangle. I would not trade a single ordinary day of it. Chapter 17. The Reunion. We went back to the place where it began. Not exactly the same. Spaces change, get rearranged, but close enough that standing in it felt like memory made physical. The last time I had been in a room that looked like this, I was a stranger. I didn't know anyone. I was full of hope and nerves, and my carefully constructed Tuesday-Sunday question strategy. This time, I walked in next to my husband. That sentence. This time, I walked in next to my husband. I still have to let it land for a moment every time I think about it. The reunion had a particular electricity to it. You have been off camera for almost a year. You have been living your life quietly in the real world, going to work and cooking dinner and navigating the ordinary texture of a marriage. And suddenly, you are back in the space where all of this began, surrounded by the people who were part of the same extraordinary and unlikely experience. There were Season 10 alumni. There were veterans from other seasons. The Love is Blind universe is bigger than it sometimes looks from the outside. The energy in the room was warm, though the warmth had complicated edges. Some relationships from our season had not made it. Some things had come out that were hard to sit with. There were people in that room who were hurting, and people who were healing, and people who were somewhere in between, trying to figure out what came next. I felt for them. I genuinely did. Because I knew what the experiment asked of people. I knew what it cost to open yourself up like that, to say yes to something that had no guaranteed outcome, to stand at an altar with the whole world watching and commit to another person. When it works, it is extraordinary. When it doesn't, the public nature of it adds a dimension of difficulty that ordinary heartbreak doesn't carry. There were moments at the reunion that caught us by surprise. Devante, who had been a presence in those pods, who had been part of the experiment alongside all of us, showed up at the reunion with news. He was expecting a child and getting married. We genuinely did not know. He had not put that in the group chat, which is its own kind of information. It was shocking in the way that good surprises are shocking. Not alarming, just unexpected. A reminder that life keeps moving for everyone, that the year after the pods is a year in which everything keeps changing for everybody. And then, near the end of the reunion, Nick and Vanessa Lashy invited Vic and me to join the married couples, the ones who had said yes and meant it, and were still together on the other side of everything. They put our picture up. and I looked at our picture up on that screen, and I thought, that's us. That is actually us. We are in the category of the ones who made it. It felt like a graduation, I told Vic afterward. It was like an induction, he said. That's my husband. One of us uses the softer word, and one of us uses the precise one, and somehow we always land in the same place. They gave us a honeymoon trip. We hadn't decided where to go. Vic had Grenada on his list, which has family meaning for him, roots that go deeper than a tourist destination. I had Italy on mine. Someone suggested Japan. The options were excellent, and we were not in a hurry. We had time. We had so much time. Chapter 18. The Anniversary. We drove to Brooklyn on our first anniversary. Flatbush. The neighborhood I had heard about through a wall before I knew what the man telling me about it looked like. I had been to Brooklyn before, Christmas with his family, meeting the people who had shaped him, walking the streets where he grew up. But this time was different. This was our anniversary. This was intentional. And I walked those streets differently than I had at Christmas, because I was a year deeper into understanding what they meant. Flatbush is loud and alive in a way that Morristown, Ohio never was and never could be. Music coming out of storefronts. People talking on corners with the kind of easiness that comes from knowing a place in your bones. Kids running, families out. A whole ecosystem of Black life that had been humming along long before Vic and long before me, and would keep humming long after. The first time I visited, I mostly just tried to keep up and not say the wrong thing. This time I noticed things. I noticed the way people greeted Vic when they recognized him, the specific warmth of a neighborhood claiming one of its own who made it somewhere. I noticed how he stood differently on those blocks, looser, more himself, like something he carried in his body could finally set itself down. I noticed the looks too. Some people glanced at us with curiosity, some with something harder than curiosity. I had learned, over the course of the year, not to shrink from those looks, not to perform a reaction to them either. I was a white woman in love with a Black man from Flatbush, walking his neighborhood on their first anniversary. That was just the truth of it. And the truth of it was also that he reached back and took my hand on that block without hesitating. And when he did, I thought, that is everything. Whatever the world is seeing when it looks at us, what I know is what is in this hand. And what is in this hand is mine. We filmed a podcast episode. We sat down and talked about the year. Honestly, the way we try to do everything. What had been easier than expected? What had been harder? What we were learning about each other and about ourselves and about the specific kind of work that a real marriage requires. The word that kept coming up was good. Not perfect, not effortless, not the Hallmark movie version where everything resolves cleanly and nobody has to apologize for anything. Good, real good, the kind that is made out of effort and honesty, and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when choosing is not the path of least resistance. The work-life balance was real. The transition into Columbus was real. The adjustment of two fully formed lives becoming one shared life was real. None of it was without friction. All of it was worth it. We talked about year 2, a home we had been saving, looking at neighborhoods, thinking about schools and community, and what we wanted our roots to look like. Deeper joint projects, the shared public work we were beginning to build together, more time with family, more presence in the church community we had been building since moving to Columbus, and, not necessarily now, but present in the conversation as something we both wanted, children. We talked about it openly, the way we talk about most things, with Vic's particular thoughtfulness and my particular willingness to say the whole thing out loud. We talked about the family we were going to make, about how our families, his sisters, my sisters, both sets of mothers and cousins and people who had been in our corners since before we knew the other existed, were already woven together in ways that made everything easier. My sisters ain't going to let that happen, Vic said about any failure to raise our future children in both of our worlds. Your sisters ain't going to let that happen, we're good. We had the memory box in the car. We opened it on our anniversary, the way we had planned, spread everything out across a table in Brooklyn, in the neighborhood that had shaped the man I married, and went through it piece by piece. The Malibu key card, the plane ticket stubs, the small objects that had accumulated into a year of evidence, a time capsule, a record, proof that we had made something real. Each piece we lifted out of that box was a chapter of a story neither of us had been able to write alone. The key card from the resort where the Pacific Ocean watched us figure out what came next. The ticket stubs from all the flights that made us possible. The little things you save without knowing exactly why, except that you know the moment mattered. This is kind of like a holy day for us, I said. That marriage wasn't just a promise between me and you. It was me, you, and God. So this is a very sacred day. Vic nodded. He knew what I meant. He always knows what I mean. That's one of the gifts of marrying someone who listens the way he does. You never have to say everything. The most important things somehow arrive before the words do. We drove back from Brooklyn that evening with the memory box on the seat between us, full of a year we wouldn't trade for anything, headed toward a second year we hadn't started yet but were already grateful for. 46 people in my graduating class. I moved out at 17. I drove an hour and a half to Cincinnati for college and kept going until I had a master's degree and a career I loved, and an apartment in Cleveland with a cat named Jill, and a question I asked everyone about Tuesdays and Sundays. And then one evening after work, I almost kept scrolling. Thank God I didn't. I clicked. I spent 2 hours filling out an application that I half expected to go nowhere, and found myself, 1 year later, in a car in Brooklyn with Victor St. John, driving home to Columbus, with a memory box full of proof that the most important story of my life had been waiting on the other side of a wall. Epilogue. Love Ain't Blind. The title of the show that brought them together says love is blind. There is truth in that, real truth. The wall in the pods gave Vic and Christine something most people never get, a conversation stripped of everything except who they actually were and how they actually chose to present themselves. No visual shorthand. No first impression snap judgments based on a face or a height, or the particular way someone's eyes look in a crowded room. No opportunity to be charmed by appearance before character had time to reveal itself. They fell in love in the dark. They built something genuine in a space where the only material available to them was words and truth, and the willingness to be honest with a stranger through a wall. But here is what they also know. A year in, love that lasts is not blind. Love that stays. The distance is exactly the opposite. It sees clearly the places where the other person is still becoming who they will be, the habits that require patience, the ways that two lives are going to need adjustment to become one life. It sees the imperfect histories and the ongoing negotiations and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that nobody films and nobody posts about. It sees all of that in full detail and keeps choosing. Vic prayed before those reveal doors opened and promised himself, whoever is coming through is already my wife. That was love with its eyes closed, beautiful, faithful, extraordinary. What he has built with Christine since then is love, with its eyes open, wide open, seeing her completely. Christine almost kept scrolling. She almost passed the post, set down the phone, fed the cat, and went to bed on an ordinary evening in Cleveland. She didn't. She clicked. She spent 2 hours answering questions about who she was and what she wanted, and she hit submit, and she waited, and she walked into those pods with her Tuesday-Sunday question ready, and her whole heart prepared to go somewhere real. She did not get to ask the question. She didn't need to. A Flatbush boy and a Morristown girl, two worlds that America keeps separate, brought together by a wall and a prayer, and a 2-hour application filled out on a Tuesday night with a cat at her feet. Different textures, same material, same fatherless childhoods, same strong mothers, same faith that became the foundation of everything. Two introverts who chose the most public possible way to meet each other and then took what they found there and built something quiet and permanent with it. She learned to move in his world. She learned the food and the music and the rhythms. She got on the dance floor and got it wrong and got back up and tried again. She sat in rooms where she was the only one who looked like her and stayed anyway. Not because it was comfortable, but because love asks you to go where your person is from. And she loved him enough to go there, fully, without making him carry her discomfort. That is not a small thing. That is the work that real love requires when it crosses the lines that the world so often keeps intact. And he reached back for her hand on a Flatbush block on their first anniversary, in front of everyone, and didn't think twice about it. Because for all the complexity the world wants to layer onto their love story, inside that story it was always simple. She was his, he was hers. Everything else was just the weather. They are homebodies. They would rather have dinner at their own table than attend the party. Jill the cat has, over time, mostly made her peace with Vic. There are still communicative bites on occasion, but the snuggling outweighs them now, and everyone in the household has accepted this as a sign of real progress. They have a memory box. They have a home church and a marriage community who thinks they met at a basketball game. They have families on both sides who have wrapped themselves around the couple and refuse to let go. They have each other. That's the whole story. That's all of it. Two people, a wall, a prayer, a poem, an 1.5-hour commute that never missed a week, a covenant instead of a contract, and the daily choice to keep showing up for the thing they found in the dark, not blind, just open to the possibility that your person is out there, that God has been quietly arranging the details, that the application you almost didn't fill out, and the door you almost didn't walk through, and the conversation you almost didn't have, are all leading somewhere you could not have designed on your own, because the design is better than anything you would have thought to ask for. Go deep, Christine said. Give it your whole effort. Your person is out there. She was just lucky enough to find hers behind a wall. Let this union continuously show the world that love ain't blind, that it exists, and it's real, because you are. Vic's closing prayer, April 9th, 2025. I want to tell you how I found this story, because it matters. I was watching Love is Blind Season 10 the way a lot of people were, looking for the drama, the fireworks, the couples you root for, and the ones you worry about. And then Vic and Christine appeared on my screen, and I put down whatever I was doing and I just watched, because what they had was different from almost everything else in that format. No noise, no performance, just two quiet, intentional people finding each other in the dark and choosing each other in the light. That's the story Books by Barron was built to tell. Not the fairy tale, not the edited version, compressed into episodes and shaped by a producer's hand. The real one, the one that starts with a woman scrolling through social media after work with a cat at her feet, and a man answering a friend's text with a hard no that slowly became a yes. The one that moves through a wall, and a prayer, and a poem, and a season of driving, and a cat who gives communicative bites. The one that ends, or rather begins, at an altar on April 9th, in front of two families who were strangers a year before, and will never be strangers again. Books by Barron exist to give couples like Vic and Christine authorship over their own story, not a network's version, not a reunion recap, their version in their voices, with all the texture and feeling that 45 edited minutes can never fully hold. Christine said it best at the end of their anniversary podcast, speaking to anyone who was still looking for what she had found. Give it your whole effort. Go deep. Be vulnerable. Your person is out there. She was just lucky enough to find hers behind a wall. To Vic and Christine, thank you for trusting me with your story. I hope I've done it justice. And to everyone listening who wonders if this kind of love still exists, the patient kind, the intentional kind, the kind built on faith and covenant and memory boxes, and a cat who mostly approves, it does. It absolutely does. Heart.